today's World Insight. A global energy crisis, rising inflation amid a prolonged pandemic, a bumpy road to recovery with aid from international lenders such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The lowdown from Erik Berglöf, the AIIB chief economist.
Number one strategic priority is to reach by 2025 more than 50% climate finance.
And the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Was war always inevitable? Professor John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago looks at how great power politics between Russia and the West collided in Ukraine. Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. China's GDP grew by 4.8% year on year in the first quarter this year, according to the latest number coming out of National Bureau of Statistics. The Bureau says China's economy got off to a steady start despite global turbulence and domestic COVID-19 outbreaks. But the pandemic still presents hurdles to global supply chains, and the geopolitical issues, particularly the Russia-Ukraine conflict, have led to a global energy crisis. Amid all these uncertainties, where is the growth momentum for the world economy, and how can the world economy recover? What is the role of a multilateral lending institution such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, otherwise known as AIIB? I asked Erik Berglöf, the AIIB chief economist. Here is our conversation. I understand, Erik, you and many of your colleagues are globalists in the real sense. But one has to point out that there are priority changes for economies around the world. For example, lately with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, that leads to the discussion in the world about the so-called energy crisis. Are we going to see energy security crisis? And as a result of that, how will the economies, be able to look at their priorities and re-streamline their priorities? What does that mean, for the AIIB, your original goals?
Well, first of all, I would say that this is indeed, as you say, a watershed, I think, in terms of the role of security, so energy security, food security, and also, of course, defense spending. So all this there's a before and after in this regard. And we should remember that this comes at a time when these emerging and developing economies are already suffering from the pandemic or the results, the economic impact.
That's right.
So they, all the buffers that they had in terms of, on fiscal resources, in terms of household budgets and corporate budgets and so on, all those have been depleted, and they now have to cope with this new shock coming their way. So AIIB is also adjusting, in the sense that we are, of course, trying to help our countries go through the pandemic. We had a special facility to help respond to that crisis. Now we have to look at the new impact that's coming on top of that pandemic impact. And yes, we will definitely have to be, very quick in our response also, because this is a very serious situation.
Let me talk about the green thing, sustainable development, climate change efforts. Earlier, AIIB has prioritized those together with many in the world. But now, look at the countries and economies who have been earlier committing to clean energy. For example, Germany is a great example of that. Now, geopolitics changes and some of the earlier priorities become secondary. How can we think about these priorities, knowing that, climate change and sustainable development is really the fate of all of ours, while at the same time, the short-term priorities have been changing so much. So how can we adjust and also balance these very two different directions?
No, I think you are absolutely right. This is going to be probably the number one challenge now to find ways of moving forward on the decarbonization agenda. Of course, investing in renewables and doing more energy efficiency and so on. But honestly, there will be, and we have seen it already. Look at what happened in the United States, for example. The massive change from a very active climate agenda, a very big shift from the previous administration, and now is focusing on producing as much oil as possible, as much, and exporting as much liquid gas as possible. So yes, I think there are changes. I just want to comment on the military, because it's actually interesting that a lot of the most advanced military has actually been working to become much better at sustainability, and this is a huge issue in the military. To how do you get power? How do you order supply lines and so on? And that's actually a lot of the innovations in renewable energy and so on have come out of this, and a lot of emphasis on energy efficiency and so on have come out of actually military consideration.
What about AIIB? Now, how would you, at a time still uncertain, because nobody knows when is the situation that it's likely to set the stage, how would you do your priorities, and how would you fine-tune your efforts?
Basically, two things going on. One is, of course, that we need to respond, as I said, both to the pandemic and to these new shock that's coming on top of the pandemic. So that's one thing. And then we have our strategic priorities, where the number one strategic priority is to reach by 2025 50-50, or more than 50% climate finance, and that still is there, and I'm quite confident that we will be able to achieve that. And a lot that we are doing are in that spirit. And I would say again, if we are successful in achieving these targets when it comes to renewables, when it comes to energy efficiency and so on, and that will help with energy security as well. So not necessarily a contradiction here. Just the problem is maybe in the very short term there may be some encouragement to go back in terms of leaving oil and leaving coal and so on.
Also about AIIB, I know you are the chief economist and not the chairman of AIIB, but from a chief economist perspective, how do you see the change? For example, AIIB was born at a time when globalization is in the mind of almost everyone. And it's also at a time when emerging economies, developing countries are making huge strides forward. It was born at a very critical historic time. What about now? How do you look at, AIIB, the nature of it, and therefore your plan?
Yeah, no, so as you said, I'm not the president. I'm not the, but I certainly share with my colleagues the belief in the multilateral approach, and that AIIB is very much aspiring to be a state-of-the-art 21st century multilateral institution, and it's built into our DNA, and I think that will not change. But I think what it offers is an opportunity to discuss among all these different parties that are now maybe fighting it out even in the battlefield, but also in various ways in economic sanctions and so on, to actually have discussions among grown-ups and trying to find.
That's a great point. That's a great point.
We need these institutions more than ever, because the unilateral way or even the bilateral way is not going to be very successful, I think, in solving many of these issues. But of course, it's also a challenge, as you say, for a multilateral institution to try to bring together all these different views and different interests and do it in a constructive way.
About the 2025 goals, that is imminent. We are going to see the result of that very soon. In fact, in just a few years, how efficient, how sufficient is AIIB in the short term will pretty much be described by that result. Now, where are we, Erik?
So I think we're actually on a good track, but it's of course important to do this in a way that it's not just ticking boxes, but it's also trying to really be innovative and find new ways of of bringing along, what the big challenge, I think, for the world now, which is, I think, unfortunately amplified by what's happened with the pandemic and with the war, is that, the emerging and developing world needs to be brought along. And, they have played a relatively small, or in some, particularly for developing countries, a very small role in contributing to the problem that we are facing in the climate space. They have not added all this CO2 that we, the advanced countries and now some of the emerging economies have added. And we must make sure that they're not left behind. And that's, I think, for AIIB is a huge responsibility. And we are the only really multilateral international institution that is owned by majority of emerging developing countries.
If you look at the GDP number, the World Bank, IMF put out earlier the predictions, all the numbers are down as a result of the obvious changes in the world. Now, how much do you see countries and economies are still committed to renewing, building high quality infrastructure?
I think it is going to be more challenging for sure, and we have to find innovative ways of bringing new kind of projects, new way of financing. Definitely bringing in the private sector. As you know, we also have the objective to have by 2030 50-50 between private sector and sovereign or government funded projects, and that for us is also extremely important objective, because we won't be able to solve the climate crisis. We won't be able to build a future, pandemic response and so on, and build any kind of infrastructure.
Many of the infrastructure projects you're doing, what do you think are some of the most innovative ways amid, the pandemic, which is still going on, and also the best ways to implement those projects despite what is we are experiencing today, the dramatic changes in politics, geopolitics? Are there some fresh new ideas coming out of AIIB that the rest of the world could take note of?
I think so. So we have one project that we are very excited about is a project in Indonesia trying to reach, all these islands and with broadband using satellites, and doing it together with the private sector. So it's a public-private partnership, and that's a very exciting project. We have a very exciting project, the first project in Asia actually, to bring in institutional investor, pension funds, and so on, that really are looking for assets for very long life. And of course, the infrastructure has, we look to bring them in, try to bring them in once the investments have been made and the first risks around construction and so on are out of the way. That's when you can bring in institutional investors. So those are very interesting, I think, innovative projects that we are working on with Amundi, the asset management company, to identify firms that we can help bring along to become climate champions and so on. So that a lot of projects that are really trying to change the landscape in Asia.
Global supply chain, global value chain. How disruptive do you see it is already happening right now as a result of many of the factors was mentioned already? And therefore, do you see there is some successful ways to approach it? How economies should prepare, how to avoid waste during this process? How is AIIB articulating this?
Well, so if you look over the last 10 years when it comes to these global value chains, what really has happened is that the emerging and developing world has taken more and more of these global value chains. These value chains have become more and more fragmented, and you need to enter just with a very small part that adds value, and that has become why it has become such an important lever for development, for joining global production. I think that flexibility and that kind of ability to adapt that these value chains and have shown, that I think is a reassurance that this will happen also going forward. If you look at what's happened in China in particular, China has taken more and more of its intermediate goods. So it used to be, the kind of workshop of the world, producing the end product, but more and more of the intermediate products are now that are used for the final production is now produced in China. And that, I think, has been the combination of that and also adding the things that increase productivity, increased use of robots, the increased use of digital technology and so on. All that has helped China to really make huge strides in terms of global value chains. And very importantly, as also moving global value chain engagement away from just the coasts, but also inside the country, like Chongqing and Chengdu, and are very important high-tech centers, well connected to global value chains. But you have other countries in Asia, like India, for example, that also been quite successful. And that has been done through very different strategies. So there's not only one way. So each country has to look at its approach, its particular context.
How much do you see countries and economies are preparing for the possible and the already existing disruptions of the global value chain?
I think the lesson from the crisis now is that this is actually much more difficult than we thought, because these global value chains are based on very close relationships, and they in these value chains, tremendous amount of information and very sensitive information is transferred, and that has to be built on trust, and that you cannot rebuild very quickly. And also the efficiency pressures, the cost pressures in these supply chains makes it very difficult to have multiple supplies. I'm not saying that this will not happen at all, but what I think is going to be still true is that this reliance on dedicated relationships lasting over long periods, maybe decades, are still going to be very important. So that is fighting against some of the things we have talked about, about geopolitics, about the technological changes and so on. So yes, I think that this is where we'll end up. We don't know right now, but my prediction is that we will actually see more of these global value chains, and they actually also, I think, can be a very important tool for decarbonization, because they, what the basis of these global value chains are the ability of these firms to implement standards and rules and across the whole value chain. And you can do that by decarbonizing, by imposing a carbon price in these value chains and so on. And that's going to be, I think, the future.
Erik Berglöf, Chief Economist of Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, in an earlier conversation with me.